for sharing the slides. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to the group, Alistair and Sean. I appreciate it. Just a bit about me. As Alistair mentioned, I'm with the OECD now, but I'm coming off almost 8 years at the Department of Agriculture in the United States. And before that, I was at the OECD. So I have the benefit of a number of years at the OECD, then going into the Department of Ag in my country to kind of work on a number of the issues that are being discussed or that you have identified in some of your plans. And obviously from a non-European perspective. And now I'm back at the OECD, so it's been interesting to have that time off, time on again. So today, I will just talk a little bit about collaboration per Alistair's direction. And I wanted to just give you a starting point for this discussion, which is the OECD Principles of Rural Policy. So as you know, you may know at the OECD, we work with countries, member countries along 3 lines when it comes to rural. We do rural reviews of rural policy elements that are in place. We have policy dialogues on the ground. We have conferences and events, and we've been doing this now for over 20 years. So we've amassed a number of different evidence and knowledge just about how our members are doing rural development. And one of the things we developed to help guide that process is the Principles of Rural Policy, which is on your screen. And also we collaborate with our Ag Directorate as well. And we're doing so now actually, because they're seeing more and more the need for us to work together on certain issues. We stress a lot in the Principles of Rural Policy, this need to collaborate to create integrated and effective strategies. We're finding more and more that it's not possible to be successful without that collaboration that's vertical and horizontal from the top to the bottom. And I say this as someone coming out of the United States where we had to, I worked in the White House for 3 years on behalf of the Department of Agriculture. And I was sent there because I had to manage 17 different departments on behalf of rural to help to solve some key problems in rural areas. But for that to work, I needed all our departments, environment, broadband infrastructure, labor to work with me. And to do that, I had to kind of work at a very high level. So it's such a big part of being effective that, you know, we put it into the Principles of Rural Policy and we work with member countries and evaluate how they're doing that. Next slide, please. One of the things that we found when we work in the OECD is that it's really rare to find strategies at the local level, tackling all these diverse problems that are working together and doing what they need to do when they are not connected and coordinated. We do find a lot of countries, a lot of our member states are working, they're developing their environmental policies, their farm policies, but if they're not connected and see the overlap, their results are not as high as it would be if they were coordinated. So we see the value of saying working in partnership is valuable to overcome weaknesses. And then strategies when designed without acknowledging actual integration can be an obstacle. So if you don't have that integrated piece, you're not seeing the success. You may see some success, but you may not see long-term success. And we're getting more and more from our member countries, this need to become more resilient to shocks, to build policies and actions for today that will help them way into the future. So a lot of the other work I'm leading is actually around foresight and futures and helping local leaders build that into their policy mechanisms and strategies to develop more long-term and flexible policies. Next slide, please. So what I wanted to do really in the time that I have was really point out like 4 or 5 factors that have come up again and again that make, that kind of illustrate why collaboration in strategies and plans are so important. One of them, and this is in no particular order, but I started with complexity. And I also wanted to kind of overlay some of the work that I know you are doing or will be doing really make the point. And really the complexity of the issues that our local communities, the communities that we all sit in, are facing, makes it so important that that coordination, even if you're looking at climate change action, environmental care, that bridges so many different departments. So when you're thinking about those priorities, how do we bring together the different communities of practice that are working on these issues as you seek to realize your objectives? Because a climate change action, there's so many pillars outside of your scope working on it, and environmental is the same, but if it's a pillar within what you're seeking to implement, how do we bring public and non-public sectors in? And I heard in our breakout session that a lot of stakeholder engagement was done to get to this point, but how do we keep that moving? Next slide, please. The other thing that we find a lot as we review member countries is this issue of efficiency, duplication, and service gaps. When you work together, when you collaborate, it's the only way to map services jointly, to agree on mechanisms that will fill in the gaps. Again, here are 3 pillars that I think are they're independent, but they also pull on different parts. Again, similar to the previous one. So how do we map them out, make sure that we're bringing in the stakeholders that are localized, that are working on this, to ensure that whatever priorities you have set, and however you measure success at the end of, however you set up your monitoring and evaluating to say we have been successful, you have actually tried to a bit coordinate and bring in some of these forces that can help to make sure that you are not duplicating efforts and there are no service gaps. You've done this work, but maybe you missed the whole, you missed the piece. Next slide, please. And here, we find that, again, to this point of duplication, that it's the most frequent at the local level in countries, leading to a drain on public resources. We know we're moving into a time where resources are not infinite. And so how can we kind of collaborate to ensure that we're not creating waste? Balancing the strategies to make sure that their shared priorities, as I've said, across all these different local agencies and stakeholders that are working in these areas. So how can we identify the shared priorities that we can work on to lead to less fragmentation and less duplication? Next slide, please. This idea, we have this idea, we see it in the OECD about achieving critical mass. So there's this here is this, how can we kind of bring everyone together to do an integrated approach? At the OECD, we talk a lot about integrated rural development, and thinking about the example I gave you earlier when I said that we at the Department of Agriculture facilitated a federal agency department with 17 different departments, all on behalf of rural. And we had our ag lobbies at the table as well. It was just about education. It was about making sure everyone understood what was needed, what people were trying to accomplish, and how we could solve agriculture and rural development related problems in a more coordinated way. Now, was it difficult? Yes. But was it necessary? Did we see better results? We did. But this idea of getting to that critical mass of figuring out how to get everyone on board is so important. And when you're dealing with entrenched difficulties or multi-generational employment or unemployment, excuse me, that requires different investments. So even if you're trying to create labor within one sector, it has a domino effect in the community. So are those other kind of implicit actors at the table, as well as the ones that are really, really needed at the table? So we are in ag, we used to talk a lot about direct and indirect. And we tend to know who our direct actors are, but do you know who your indirect actors are? For example, if you're bringing in, creating labor opportunities, then there are spillovers. And do we have the housing, the training, the network, the infrastructure to support whatever is being built up? Because that in the end affects the objectives that one is trying to reach. Next slide, please. We talk a lot in the OECD about building social capital. You know, this again goes to the larger piece that I think is well reflected, which are the stakeholder engagements. But problems don't just get solved in a strategy, it's the day-to-day and knowing the right people that are helping to move these pillars along are key. So those, who are those? We found that local social networks support the spread of ideas, and the areas that we have evaluated that have the denser or larger networks of actors are increasingly the most successful. So this idea of not just of keeping that stakeholder base, that public-private kind of information chain going is so vital to making sure that we're in sync in real time on the information that we're receiving, and that we're preparing well for what is needed on the ground, as well as what you're trying to achieve with all of the different priorities. Next slide, please. But collaboration is difficult, as you know, and some of the areas that we have identified are like the importance of building those networks, as I just said, improving that horizontal and vertical communication. It's so important. Gaining consensus on the most important cross-cutting issues which need to be worked on together. I would say point 3 is really the buy-in process. For example, coming into a common language. In the United States, when we worked on some of the issues, we had a lot of farm suicides. We had a lot of farmers with mental health issues. And those issues are sitting outside of the Department of Agriculture. So it became very important for us to bring the other departments inside Ag to help translate the information and the work that they have, and to figure out how we could collaborate to address some of the issues. But at the end of the day, the farm suicides was just as much about, the economy not doing well. So it was a multi-pronged approach where we dealt with the health side, and because I was formerly the rural health liaison for the Department of Ag, but we also had to deal with the economic aspects of it as well. So tackling all of those aspects together was why we needed strong coordination, because if we only did it we took it one pillar at a time, we would still not have seen the turnaround that we needed. So exploring a joint action, agreed priorities requires, it required a lot of negotiating, trade-offs, synergies, and necessary sacrifices. And one of the things I left off there is, again, this issue of getting to a common language. Each of the departments that we collaborate with have different priorities. So how do we speak the same language at the table to say we're going towards a common goal? And it requires a bit of education. And I can say this as a person who has been in a number of meetings in my former role where I was asked, why is the Department of Agriculture at the table? I cannot tell you enough how many times I've been asked that if I'm in a meeting on labor or health, why is the Department of Agriculture here? And it's as much, but once we educated each other, it became, why isn't the Department of Agriculture here? Let's pause the meeting and bring them in. So getting to the table early helps you recognize and realize your priorities, but have a really good sense of awareness of the larger issues at stake and where you fit within it. Give priority possible to targets that are set collectively. That helps to promote and keep that collaboration going, to see that we didn't do all this work, but then someone went off and did their own thing and kind of ignored what we discussed together. And that again is difficult, but if we are translating things into a common language, then it becomes easier to set those environmental priorities, those climate change priorities, those, employment priorities where maybe you prioritize gender. All of those elements come together well when we all are speaking the same language at the table, and explore those joint actions across a number of different areas and look at your priorities in different ways. You may say, if you're listening to me, well, I'm only doing this and this affects only farm, but nothing affects only one thing in a rural community, as you all know. It affects infrastructure. You're dependent on, again, those indirect pieces that have to be in place for the group to be successful. So having that awareness of that is just as important. And I think I have one more slide. And so just to recap a bit of what I just said, you know, it's just reinforcing again what I think everyone on this who's listening to me already knows, because you went through it maybe as part of your stakeholder engagement, but keeping that momentum, which I know is difficult going forward. Here are, you know, these are just some ideas about why it's important to keep that collaboration on the public and private side going as you are realizing your different objectives, because we're seeing more and more that resiliency factor. 20 years from now, are you putting those mechanisms in place that are flexible so that you don't have to, it's resilient. And a lot of that comes from having multiple diverse stakeholders at the table, helping to shape the decisions that are and the plans that are being developed. So I'm happy to take any questions or have you reach out to me if you have any questions. I'll stop there. Thank you.